In the late 19th century, a man walked the streets of a small American town carrying a face that defied every assumption about what a human being should look like. He had 2 noses. He had 3 eyes. And yet, against all odds, he lived a life that would challenge everything his community believed about difference, dignity, and what it means to be human. His name was William Durks, and for more than a century, his story has been reduced to a footnote in medical textbooks and a handful of fading photographs that circulated among collectors of the bizarre. But behind those images was a person who navigated a world that wasn't built for him, who faced daily challenges most of us can't begin to imagine, and who somehow found a way to exist in a society that treated difference as spectacle. William Durks was born sometime in the early 1860s, though the exact date and location remain uncertain. What we do know is that he entered the world with a condition so rare that even today, medical professionals might go their entire careers without encountering a single case. The condition is called Frontonasal Dysplasia, a developmental disorder that occurs when the frontal and nasal prominences of the fetal face fail to fuse properly during the first trimester of pregnancy. The result, in Durks's case, was profound. His face developed with a complete duplication of the nose, 2 separate nasal structures positioned side by side. His eyes, rather than being arranged in the typical horizontal configuration, were positioned with a 3rd eye located centrally above the bridge where a single nose would normally be. The condition affected not just the external appearance of his face, but the underlying bone structure, creating a skull formation that was unlike anything in standard human anatomy. In the 21st century, we have the language of genetics and embryology to explain frontonasal dysplasia. We understand it as a disruption in the normal signaling, pathways that guide facial development, likely involving specific genes that regulate cell migration and tissue formation. We know it's extraordinarily rare, occurring perhaps once in every 100,000 births, and that it exists on a spectrum of severity. But William Durks wasn't born into a world with that understanding. He was born into an America still reeling from the Civil War, a place where medical knowledge was limited and superstition filled the gaps. A child born with a severe facial difference wasn't seen as the product of random genetic variation. Such a child was often viewed as cursed, as punishment for parental sin, or as evidence of something fundamentally wrong in the moral fabric of the family. We don't know what William's parents thought when they first saw him. There are no letters, no diaries, no recorded statements. What we have are the photographs that came later, images taken when William was already an adult, and the scattered references to him in medical journals and newspapers from the period. These sources tell us he survived infancy, which itself was remarkable. Children born with severe craniofacial abnormalities in the 19th century faced extraordinary mortality risks. Many died within days or weeks of birth, not because of the facial differences themselves, but because of associated complications. Frontonasal dysplasia can affect the development of the brain, the airways, and the structures necessary for feeding. Without modern surgical intervention, without antibiotics, without the ability to manage complications, survival was far from guaranteed. But William lived. He made it through infancy, through childhood, through the vulnerable years when infection or respiratory complications could have easily killed him. Someone cared for him. Someone kept him alive. The historical record offers almost no information about his early life. We don't know if he had siblings, whether his family was wealthy or poor, whether they lived in a city or in rural isolation. What we can infer, based on what happened later, is that at some point his family either couldn't or wouldn't continue caring for him, and William entered the world that awaited people with visible differences in 19th century America. That world was the world of the sideshow. By the 1880s, William Durks was appearing in dime museums and traveling exhibitions, displayed alongside other people whose bodies deviated from the norm. These weren't the elaborate circus spectacles that people often imagine when they think of sideshows. They were grittier, smaller operations, often set up in storefronts or temporary halls, charging 10 or 25 cents for admission. The language used to advertise these exhibitions is difficult to read today. William was billed as the man with 2 faces, or the 3-eyed marvel. Promotional materials described him in terms designed to shock and titillate, emphasizing the strangeness of his appearance, framing him as a curiosity rather than a person. But here's what those advertisements don't tell you. William Durks was functional. He could see, though his vision was likely compromised by the unusual positioning of his eyes and the structural abnormalities of his skull. He could breathe through at least one of his nasal passages. He could speak, though we have no recordings of his voice and no detailed descriptions of how his speech sounded. He could understand what was being said to him. He had cognitive awareness, emotional responses, the full range of human consciousness trapped inside a body that the world found repellent. Photographs of William from this period show a man dressed in ordinary clothing, sitting or standing for the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Is it resignation? Defiance? Simple patience with yet another photographer documenting his difference? We can't know. But what's striking about these images is what they reveal about the reality of his condition versus the sensationalized descriptions in the advertisements. The duplication of his nose wasn't symmetrical. One nasal structure was larger and more developed than the other. The positioning of his three eyes created a facial structure that was undeniably unusual, but the eyes themselves appeared functional, tracking the camera, suggesting he could see well enough to navigate the world. His skull was broader than typical, flattened in some areas and protruding in others, giving his head an elongated appearance. These weren't the monstrous deformities the sideshow advertisements promised. They were the physical manifestations of a developmental difference, significant and profound, but ultimately just variations in the way human tissue can form. And yet, to the audiences who paid to see him, William Durks was a monster. This is the fundamental cruelty at the heart of his story. He was born into a body that functioned well enough to keep him alive but looked different, enough to make him unemployable in any conventional sense. He had intelligence, awareness, and presumably the same desire for dignity and connection that every human being has. But the only way he could survive economically was to allow himself to be put on display, to be stared at, to be reduced to the sum of his facial differences. The sideshow industry of the late 19th century was built on this exploitation, but it's worth understanding that for many of the people who worked in it, there weren't alternatives. This was before disability rights, before social safety nets, before any cultural recognition that people with differences deserved accommodation rather than spectacle. For someone like William Durks, the choice wasn't between dignified employment and the sideshow. The choice was between the sideshow and destitution. So, he traveled. He appeared in cities across the eastern United States, standing on platforms, sitting for photographs, enduring the stares and the comments, and the pointing fingers of people who had paid for the privilege of gawking at him. And somewhere in the midst of this, something unexpected happened. William Durks caught the attention of the medical establishment. In 1887, a physician named Dr. Samuel Gross published a brief case study in a medical journal describing a patient he had examined during a visit to a traveling exhibition in Philadelphia. The patient was William Durks, and Dr. Gross's account is one of the few surviving documents that treats William as a medical subject rather than a carnival attraction. Dr. Gross described the physical characteristics of William's condition in clinical detail. He noted the complete duplication of the nasal structures, the unusual eye positioning, the cranial abnormalities. He measured the distance between William's eyes, the width of his skull, the proportions of his facial features. He tested William's vision and found that all three eyes appeared to have some degree of function, though the central eye had limited mobility and probably contributed more to light perception than to detailed vision. What's remarkable about Dr. Gross's account isn't the medical observations themselves, it's the tone. Dr. Gross wrote about William with a degree of respect and curiosity that's absent from almost every other contemporary reference to him. He didn't use terms like monstrosity or freak. He referred to William by name. He noted that William was cooperative during the examination, that he seemed to understand the questions being asked, that he displayed what Dr. Gross called normal intelligence and emotional effect. This was significant. In the medical thinking of the time, severe physical abnormalities were often assumed to be accompanied by intellectual disability. The prevailing theory was that if the body was malformed, the mind must be as well. Dr. Gross's observations challenged that assumption, at least in William's case. Here was a man with profound craniofacial differences who was nonetheless cognitively typical, capable of communication, aware of his circumstances. Dr. Gross concluded his case study with a question. He wondered whether William's condition might be hereditary, whether it ran in families, whether it might be passed to children if William ever had any. It was a reasonable medical question given the knowledge of the time, but it's hard to read it now without thinking about the assumptions embedded in it. The idea that William might have children, that he might have a family, a life beyond the sideshow, seems not to have been considered as an actual possibility. The question was theoretical, academic, divorced from the reality of William's existence. But Dr. Gross's case study did accomplish something important. It brought William Durks to the attention of other physicians and researchers interested in craniofacial abnormalities. Over the next several years, William was examined by at least 3 other doctors, each of whom published their own observations. These examinations weren't motivated by a desire to help William. There were no treatments for his condition, no surgeries that could normalize his appearance. The examinations were purely for the advancement of medical knowledge, and William's participation, to the extent that it was voluntary, was probably motivated by the small payments these doctors offered. Through these medical accounts, we get glimpses of William's daily reality. One physician noted that William ate slowly and carefully, that he had difficulty with certain foods because of the structure of his palate and the positioning of his teeth. Another observed that William spoke quietly and often had to repeat himself because his speech was difficult for others to understand. A third mentioned that William seemed withdrawn during the examination, answering questions with single words when possible, showing little interest in engaging beyond what was required. These observations paint a picture of a man who had learned to minimize his interactions, to take up as little space as possible, to endure what needed to be endured without expecting anything more. It's the psychological adaptation of someone who has spent a lifetime being treated as an object rather than a subject, as something to be examined rather than someone to be known. And yet, William continued to survive. Through the 1880s and into the 1890s, he appeared in exhibitions across the country. He was photographed repeatedly, those images sold as carte de visite to collectors and curiosity seekers. His face became one of the most documented examples of extreme craniofacial difference in the medical and popular literature of the era. But who was he beyond that face? What did he think about? What did he want? Did he have friends, people who saw past his appearance? Did he have moments of joy, experiences that transcended the dehumanizing context of his public life? The historical record is almost completely silent on these questions. William Durks exists in the archives as a body, a medical curiosity, a source of revenue for the people who exhibited him. He doesn't exist as a person with an interior life, with hopes or fears or dreams. There is, however, one tantalizing exception. In 1892, a reporter for a New York newspaper wrote a feature article about a dime museum in the Bowery. The article was typical of the genre, describing the various human oddities on display with a mix of fascination and condescension. But buried in the middle of the piece was a paragraph about William Durks that stands out for its unusual perspective. The reporter described approaching William between shows and attempting to strike up a conversation. William, according to the account, was initially reluctant to engage, but eventually answered a few questions. When asked how he felt about being on display, William reportedly said something that the reporter found surprising enough to quote directly. "It's a living," William said, "better than begging." The reporter seemed taken aback by this pragmatic response, as if he'd expected something more dramatic or emotional. But William's answer, if accurately reported, reveals a clear-eyed understanding of his circumstances. He wasn't deluded about what he was doing. He wasn't unaware of the exploitation. He simply recognized that in a world with no place for him, the sideshow was the least bad option available. The reporter then asked William if he had family, people who cared about him. William's answer was brief. "Not anymore." The reporter didn't follow up on that statement. and the article moved on to describe other exhibits in the museum. But those two words, "not anymore," carry a weight of loss that the reporter apparently didn't recognize or didn't care to explore. Had William's family died? Had they abandoned him? Had he made a conscious choice to distance himself from them, to spare them the association with his public life? We don't know. What we do know is that by the mid-1890s, references to William Durks in newspapers and medical journals began to decline. He appeared in fewer exhibitions. His photographs showed up less frequently in collections. It's possible that he was aging, that the physical toll of his condition was making it harder for him to work. It's also possible that public taste was changing, that the appetite for human oddity exhibitions was beginning to wane as other forms of entertainment became available. By the turn of the century, William Durks had essentially disappeared from public view. There are no records of exhibitions featuring him after 1900, no new photographs, no medical examinations, no newspaper mentions. For a man who had been so extensively documented during the height of his exhibition years, the silence is striking. For decades, historians assumed that William had died around the turn of the century, probably in poverty and obscurity like so many others who had worked in the sideshow industry. But in 1973, a researcher named Margaret Fielding made a discovery that changed that assumption. Margaret Fielding was a graduate student studying the history of disability in the sideshow industry in America. She was working her way through death records and asylum admissions in several eastern states, trying to trace what had happened to the people who had been exhibited in the late 19th century. Most had simply vanished from the record, their fates unknown. But while searching through the records of a state institution in Pennsylvania, Fielding found an admission entry from 1903 for a patient named William Durks, described as severely disfigured and suffering from respiratory complications. The entry noted his age as approximately 40 years old, which would have been consistent with what was known about the William Durks who had been exhibited in the previous decades. Fielding requested the full patient file. What she found was a thin folder containing just a few pages of notes, but those notes confirmed that this was indeed the William Durks who had appeared in sideshows across the country. The intake examination described his facial structure in terms that matched the medical case studies from the 1880s and 90s. The two noses, the three eyes, the unusual cranial formation. It was him. William had been admitted to the institution in the fall of 1903. The circumstances of his admission weren't entirely clear from the file, but the note suggested he had been found living on the streets, seriously ill, unable to care for himself. A social worker had arranged for his placement in the institution, which housed people with physical disabilities, mental illness, and chronic medical conditions. The institutional records painted a grim picture. William was placed in a ward with other patients who had severe physical differences. The care was minimal, focused primarily on basic feeding and hygiene. There's no indication that any attempt was made to treat his respiratory problems or to address his other medical needs. The institution was overcrowded, understaffed, and operating on a shoestring budget. Patients weren't expected to recover or improve. They were simply warehoused until they died. William Durks lived in that institution for 7 years. The patient notes from those years are sparse and perfunctory. Patient quiet, no incidents. Patient refused food, required assistance. Patient showing signs of respiratory distress, no treatment available. The notes are written in a bureaucratic shorthand that reduces William to a set of symptoms and behaviors, stripping away any sense of his personhood even more thoroughly than the sideshow advertisements had done. But tucked into the file was one document that offered a different perspective. In 1907, a volunteer from a local church visited the institution to provide religious services to the patients. After her visit, she wrote a letter to the institution's director describing her experience. In the letter, she mentioned meeting William Durks. "I spoke with the man called William, who has the unusual face," she wrote. "He seemed quite lucid and responded to my questions about whether he would like prayer. He said he would. When I asked if there was anything specific he wished to pray for, he thought for a long moment and then said, 'Peace.' I found him to be gentle in manner and not at all frightening despite his appearance. I wonder if he might benefit from more frequent visitors, as he seemed quite alone." There's no indication that the director responded to this letter or that William received any additional visitors. The volunteer's observation that William seemed alone was almost certainly accurate. The institutional records contain no mention of anyone coming to see him, no letters received, no family members or friends making inquiries about his well-being. William Durks died on January 14, 1910. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though given his long-standing respiratory issues, the pneumonia was likely a complication of his underlying condition. He was approximately 47 years old. He was buried in the institution's cemetery, a small plot reserved for patients who had no family to claim them. His grave was marked with a simple stone, bearing only a number, not his name. This was standard practice at the time. The numbered graves made it possible to maintain records of who was buried where without the expense of engraved headstones. For more than 60 years, William Durks rested in that unmarked grave, his name known only to a few historians and medical researchers who occasionally referenced his case in academic papers about craniofacial abnormalities. He was a footnote, a curiosity from a bygone era, a cautionary example of how society had once treated people with differences. But in the 1980s, something began to change. Disability rights advocates and historians started pushing back against the erasure of people like William Durks, arguing that their stories deserved to be told with dignity, and that the institutional and entertainment systems that had exploited them needed to be acknowledged and examined. In 1994, a coalition of disability rights organizations in Pennsylvania launched a project to identify and memorialize people with disabilities who had been buried in unmarked institutional graves. William Durks was one of the individuals they identified. In 1997, on what would have been the approximate anniversary of his birth, a new headstone was placed at his grave. This one bore his name, his approximate birth and death years, and a simple inscription: William Durks. He endured. It's a sparse memorial, but perhaps that's appropriate. William Durks's life was defined by endurance. He endured a body that made every aspect of existence more difficult. He endured a society that saw him as a spectacle rather than a person. He endured the exploitation of the sideshow circuit, the clinical detachment of medical examination, the isolation of institutional life. He endured until endurance was no longer possible. What we know about frontonasal dysplasia today would have made no difference to William. The condition still has no cure. Children born with severe cases still require multiple surgeries, extensive medical intervention, and ongoing support. But what has changed is the context in which they live. They're not exhibited. They're not reduced to their differences. They have legal protections, access to health care, educational opportunities, and communities that recognize their humanity. William Durks had none of that. He lived in a time when difference meant marginalization, when survival often required allowing yourself to be degraded, when the alternative to exploitation was destitution. His life was shaped by forces beyond his control, by medical luck that gave him a functional mind and a body the world couldn't accept, by economic systems that offered no place for people who couldn't conform. And yet, he lived. He survived childhood against the odds. He found a way to exist in a world that didn't want him. He maintained enough sense of self to articulate, when asked, that he wanted peace. That suggests an interior life richer and more complex than any of the people who documented him seemed to recognize. The photographs of William Durks that survive are unsettling to look at, not because his face is inherently frightening, but because of what they represent. They're artifacts of a time when human beings could be bought and sold for the price of a ticket, when difference was treated as entertainment, when the most intimate aspects of a person's physical existence could be put on display without consent or compensation. But William himself, the person behind that face, remains largely unknown. We have the external facts of his existence, the medical descriptions, the institutional records. What we don't have is his voice, his perspective, his understanding of his own life. In the end, perhaps the most important question about William Durks isn't what his life was like, but what it should have been. What might he have accomplished if he'd been born into a world that valued him? What relationships might he have formed? What contributions might he have made? What ordinary joys might he have experienced if his difference had been accommodated rather than exploited? We'll never know. But asking the question matters because it forces us to confront how much human potential has been wasted throughout history. How many lives have been reduced to spectacle or tragedy when they should have been allowed to simply unfold as lives do, with all the complexity and dignity that entails. William Durks deserved better than he got. The fact that we can recognize that now doesn't change what happened to him, but it does suggest that we've moved, however imperfectly, toward a world where the next person born, with his condition, might have a chance at something more than mere endurance. If William Durks could speak to us now, what do you think he would want us to understand about what his life was really like? If you enjoy uncovering stories of history left behind, consider subscribing to Lost and True.